Good morning. My name is Ellen Greenwood. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And as today's worship associate, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Westside Unitarian Universalist Church. Here at Westside, we welcome old friends and new, young and old. We welcome those of you who are here with us in person, and we welcome those of you who are joining us either today or at a later time through the magic of YouTube. You are an essential part of our community. Whether today is your first or your 1000th Sunday in our midst, we are stronger because you are here with us. We are one people of many beliefs, many origins, sexualities, and genders. We are all growing, all learning, all loved. Just as you are welcome here. If you are with us here in person, we hope that you will stay after the service for some coffee or tea and conversation. If you are new to Westside, you might want to take a look at some of the informational brochures that are over there in the window, as Bridget, aka Vanna, is showing us. That might give you a few ideas about what we are about. Just a couple of announcements. You have announcements in your order of service. They are all very important. You have announcements scrolling on your screen if you're with us virtually. But I do want to point out that July 28th, a pretty interesting event will be happening here. Lori Allion, who is a Westside member, is going to be leading a 5 wishes discussion. So you can read about that here and what that involves, and if that's something you have already done but you need some help with, you want to look at again, or something you want to start from the beginning, then you might want to come and see about that on July 28th. And then also in September, September 20th through the 22nd, Reverend Carol will be leading a Spirit Quest weekend at Elkmont. There's information about that also here in your order of service and should be on your screen. There are forms on the table at the back with our contribution box that you can fill out if you want to attend that weekend. And from what I've heard, it is a wonderful experience. I think that's all we need to announce out loud this morning. Okay, very good. If that's the case, then at this time, Reverend Carol Bodeau will invite our Tibetan singing bowl to sing for us.
Thanks, Ellen. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all here this morning. I am Reverend Carol Bodeau. I am privileged to serve here as minister. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. This morning in our spiritual practices gathering, we were practicing slowing down. So we're going to cultivate a little bit of that in our service this morning as well. We can get awfully caught up in trying to get a lot done and get a lot of places and get everything accomplished. I would invite you, as the bowl sounds, to settle in and consider this next little bit of time an opportunity to just listen, learn, rest, absorb, not have to go anywhere or do anything or be anything except just here.
And Reverend Carol will light our chalice for us. I find it interesting that I struggled to find Unitarian Universalist words on the topic of sin for our chalice lighting today. Worship Web, the UUA's online resource for worship, has absolutely nothing to say about sin. It seems that we UUs talk lots more about love and acceptance than we do sin. And I've mulled for a couple of days exactly what to make of that. But I have chosen these words, also from the Worship Web, by Tara Humphreys for our chalice lighting today. Whether you are from the South, the East, the North, or the West, whether you were born into this faith, found it, or it found you, whether you feel at home or are just trying to find your place, whether you believe in God, are open to mystery, or have no idea, whether you are unemployed, underemployed, cobbling things together, overworking, or in school, whether you are holding anxiety, grief, confusion, anger, hope, restlessness, or deep peace, Unitarian Universalism has a place for you. It is right here, in person and virtually, and this chalice is lit for you. Now, we have started the custom some time ago of lighting candles for good things in the world and bad things in the world, especially because we seem to be constantly troubled by everything that's going wrong in our world. And many times our candle of concern is lit, as we're going to do this morning, for people who are struggling, who are dying, who are suffering because of war. And it seems that every time I hear there is another location in our world that is torn by war. So we're going to light that candle and hold all these people in our hearts. This morning, Reverend Carol mentioned something to me that, you know, it's hard to look for a bright side in the midst of war, but sometimes positive things do come out of war. And she mentioned a news story she heard, I think just this morning, about women in the Ukraine who are learning to do many of those skills that have always been reserved for men. It's a little bit reminiscent of the Rosie the Riveter movement in our country during World War II. And I didn't know much about it, so I looked it up right quick. And evidently what we are learning is that women are being retrained. There are several programs, like Reskilling Ukraine is one, where women are learning to be cargo truck drivers, and just many other jobs that typically people would say, that's a man's job. You can't do, you don't want to do that. And who knows how long the results of that will stay with that society and spread maybe to other societies. So we'll light a candle of hope for that. And at this time, we are going to sing. In your hymnals, you'll find Amazing Grace on number 205. And
Only 3 verses.
only the first 3 verses.
You don't have to stand up.
We're going to let you sit. All you have to do is sing.
Are we going to say the wretch or the soul?
We're saying wretch because we're talking about sin, so say wretch.
Yeah. You can just retch all you want to.
Say wretch.
Amazing grace, how
Okay, you don't have to raise your hands, but my first question is, for how many of us in this room is that song a little uncomfortable? You can raise your hand if you'd like to. That song is uncomfortable theologically for Unitarian Universalists for many good reasons. It is one that we hear a lot. It's one that we're familiar with. And some of us may even be familiar with the song's backstory, which is particularly interesting. So the backstory of the song Amazing Grace is this. It was written in 1772 by a minister named John Newton. John Newton had been a former slave trader. So he owned slave trading ships and traded slaves back and forth across the Atlantic. He had a conversion experience, repented of that particular trade and work, became an abolitionist, and then became a minister and wrote that song. So the words of the song are meant to convey some sense of his transformation. So he says he had been a wretch, lost in wrongdoing, but had been found and restored to true vision of what is right. Grace had been his savior, leading him out of the snares of the world into the light of goodness and truth. Now, one of the core concepts that's underpinning this, there's a lot of theology there. We don't have the 7 or 8 or 10 hours that it would take to unpack all of the theological concepts that are in that song, many of which Unitarian Universalism sees differently than John Newton did. But one of the core concepts underneath that song, it's not named in the song, but it is the concept of sin, which most of us have heard of. Most of us have heard the word sin. Most of us have some vague idea of what somebody means when they say it. The dangers, toils, and snares that John Newton mentions in the song are, in fact, the dangers and toils and snares of sin. Those are temptations to sin, and grace is the way, in Christian terms, that in the Christian theology, the love of God redeems a sinner despite sinning. But our question, and the reason this sermon is called Settling with Sin, is because most of us here, if you're in a Unitarian Universalist setting, are here because you have some questions about some more conventional theologies, or you see things in a broader way. So what exactly is sin? We, of course, all would agree that, like in John Newton's story, that slavery, the life John Newton was immersed in before his conversion, is wrong. That's wrong. But when we hear that word sin, we know it encompasses a whole lot of things. People mean a whole lot of things by that. And depending on the speaker, they could mean all kinds of things that other people don't think of as sin. So here, I'm going to give you a chance to shout out, and I will repeat it into the microphone. What exactly is sin? Somebody want to take a stab at defining sin? Y'all know what it feels like when someone looks at you and says, "You're a sinner." But what exactly do we think sin means?
Disobeying God's rules.
Disobeying God's rules. I see, who is that? Charlie. Charlie, what would you say?
The Buddhists claim that the origin of sin is desire.
Okay. The Buddhists claim that the origin of sin is desire. All right?
Missing the mark.
Missing the mark.
Hurting others.
Hurting others. Separation from God.
Coveting.
Coveting, a very specific sin.
How about those 7 sloths?
We'll get to the 7 deadly sins in a few minutes. We're going to get to those. Judgment. Okay.
The groups you belong to.
Stereotyping? Okay, stereotyping is somehow connected to sin. All right.
Lying.
What? Cheating and lying. We'll get to that list in a minute of the mortal sins. Yeah. So the deal is this. The word sin doesn't appear in the Bible, clearly, because it wasn't in English originally, right? Most of the theologies of sin are rooted in words written down in what we think of as the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, but there are lots and lots and lots of words from Greek and Hebrew that appear in the original versions of that text that are now translated as sin. And those words have different meanings. The word sin itself has deep roots that go back to Proto-Indo-European words that basically mean, yup, you're guilty, found guilty. But the primary source of our Western explanations from sin come from this group of Hebrew and Greek words that are found in the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. Now, I'm going to give you a terminology right away before we start. In traditional, conventional Christian language, the terms used to describe the two portions of the Bible are the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay? More modern scholars and theologians call those slightly different things. They call them the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures to show respect for Jewish people who feel sort of hurt by the idea that they're the old thing and the cool new thing is Christianity, which was why those terms old and new were coined, to describe the new as the better new thing that replaced the old, which is, so we now, those of us who are trying to show respect to our Jewish neighbors, call them the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. So you're going to hear me do that, okay? So we're going to do a little history review today. In the Hebrew scriptures, the most commonly used terms that are now translated or understood to mean sin are these. Ra, which is the most frequently used term. It's used over 600 times in the Hebrew scriptures. And it just means bad. Bad. Okay. Second most common Hebrew term is rasha, which means wickedness. So it's a kind of bad that's morally wrong. Okay? That's used over 250 times. Third in the list is chata, which is, it's an offense deserving punishment. And right close to that is avon, which means iniquity or perversity, both used over 200 times. Finally, pesha means transgression and implies, the others don't necessarily imply this, but the word pesha implies rebellion. Last couple of words, ta and shaga simply mean to go astray. Now, it's important to understand a couple things about Jewish thought relative to these concepts. In a minute, we're going to talk more about this idea of original sin, but it's important to understand that in Jewish theology, in that time as well as in modern times, there was no understanding of original sin. Okay? At the time of Jesus of Nazareth, sin, the words that meant sin, basically meant a violation of Jewish law or a violation of temple law. And the punishment for such law breaking, which was often physical, was meted out by a group called the Sanhedrin or the Sanhedrin. So if you know the story of Jesus of Nazareth's life, it is actually the Sanhedrin that arrest him in Jerusalem and hold the first trial. They're the ones who ultimately bring him before Pontius Pilate, okay? So their job was to mete out punishments for violations of Jewish laws, okay? Now, the Christian scriptures, which are often referred to as the New Testament, you're gonna find more of the Greek words there, right? And some of the most common of those, the most popular Greek word that we see in the Christian scriptures is called hamartia. And hamartia basically means mistake, error. messing up. And it gives us the name for the study or the theology of sin, which is called hamartiology. Okay? Another really common Greek word that you will see there is called akrasia, which it basically means not living up to your values, being weak-willed and failing to act with self-control. So it's interesting when we think about the context of those Greek words about what Greek philosophers had to say about this concept. Plato and Aristotle discussed hamartia and akrasia at length. They understood hamartia as the tragic flaw of a hero, which arose from the hero's innate gift and had somehow, through circumstances or choice, gone tragically awry. So the hero's journey, often the redemption for the hero, involves reclamation or repair after the tragic misuse or misdirection of the heroic gift. It's interesting. Both Plato and Aristotle denied that it was possible to consciously act contrary to one's highest values. I would like to spend a lot more time reading about this because this is fascinating. According to them, akrasia, or weakness of will, was rooted in ignorance, and therefore you couldn't do it consciously. It was a result of the ability of passion to overpower reason, and so you weren't in your right mind when you violated your own will, your own values, so therefore it wasn't a conscious act. A few other Greek terms. Asibia, which means impiety. Anomos, which means lawless. Kekos, meaning depraved or worthless. And ponros, meaning hurtful, morally culpable. So think about that, right? Think about the subtleties in language. Think about our modern language. I want you to think about something you've said about a friend, neighbor, or family member recently, in which you said they were doing something bad or wrong. Some words you might have used to make a judgment. So think about some of these. He's so hypocritical. They are downright evil. That was immoral. What a rebel. Hear the subtleties in those words. There are subtleties here that are important. They are very different shadings in the spectrum of judging human behavior. Now, this same sort of complexity is recorded in the texts that are included in the Bible and those surrounding the life of Jesus of Nazareth. But the church, in the centuries following his life, following that time, began to codify a theology of sin to make things simpler. Okay, now we get to those 7 deadly sins and some of those things. Okay, now two of the main theological concepts at the center of contemporary understandings and definitions of sin are that of original sin and the 7 deadly sins. These are two big, important kinds of concepts that underpin a lot of what people mean when they say the word sin. These are systems that provide a sort of taxonomy of sin so that believers can understand where certain actions rank in the hierarchy of sinfulness. So, little timeline here. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, and this is another terminology thing that I've mentioned before, and I'm going to remind you of it again, we used to say BC and AD, before Christ and Anno Domini in the year of our Lord. Again, in respect for other religious traditions, contemporary scholars and theologians who want to show respect for all traditions say BCE, before the Common Era, and CE in the Common Era, which is more neutral and less about a specific religion. So in the 2nd century of the Common Era, as the forming Christian church was developing its doctrines, people began to discuss whether or not sin was an innate quality of humanity. Now remember what I said before. Jesus and the Judaic culture he was in said that sin was not innate in humans. Interestingly enough, the best I can understand this theology, the way Hebrew scholars that I have read talk about it, A child is born sinless. The quality of sinfulness develops at some not very well-defined, ambiguous time during youth. Okay? So in the Jewish theology, sin is an absolute part of the human condition, but rather than being inborn and innate, it's circumstantial. Right? So it's part of the world and the circumstances, but it's not innate to the person. But early Christian leaders began to talk about it as innate. And of course, these thoughts center around the story of Adam and Eve, which was central. Remember, that was central to the Jewish scriptures as well, but they didn't interpret it in the same way. Now, so fast forward a couple hundred years, around the year 400, Augustine of Hippo, Christian church leader, Catholic church leader, first used the term original sin, in Latin, peccatum originale. And the church councils of Carthage in 411 to 418 and in Church Council of Orange in 529 formalized this idea of original sin as part of church doctrine. Now, there's an interesting theological twist here that I don't really understand and would like to research to understand better. At some point, the idea of original sin went from just including the idea of Eve eating the apple and the original sin that we inherited from Eve, somehow it started to include the original sin-ishness of being humans who were culpable for Jesus's death. Because I have literally in the last week had someone say to me something about that we are all culpable for being responsible for Jesus being killed. So that's, I wrote here theological acrobatics. I don't really understand how that theology works out. I'm sure that there are church leaders who spent a really long time writing books about that. I haven't read them. But there's some complexity to this idea of original sin that takes some figuring out. Okay, we're going to put that aside for now because I haven't read those books this week. Hold on to this basic thought. The absolutely primary basic concept of original sin, which is central to conceptions of sin in most conventional contexts today, was created 400 years after the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay? Now, in hamartiology, which is, remember, that's the study and the theology of sin, sin is divided into two basic types: original, which we were just talking about, inborn and innate, and actual sin, which is acts of wrongdoing. And sin can be expressed in either material or formal ways. So in material sin, the sinner understands that they're doing wrong. Okay? But in a formal sin, it's really a sin, but you didn't know it was a sin. A formal sin, the sinner doesn't know the sinful nature of wrongdoing through some kind of ignorance. Okay? Actual sins are those that are chosen acts, which are sinful beyond the basic fact of our innate original sinfulness. We're going to subdivide. Now we're taking another step in the taxonomy. It reminds me of who is it? Katie put ketchup on Father's good shoes. Remember having to learn kingdom, phylum, order. Did anybody learn that? When you learn taxonomy of plants and animals, there's like a code and you go. So sins are like that too, right? So you've got original sins and actual sins. We're going to subdivide actual sins into smaller categories now. Actual sins can be either mortal or venial. Anybody ever heard these terms? Okay, so I was naive, and I grew up in the Catholic Church, so I should have known this in advance, but I'm thinking mortal sins are the really, really bad ones. Unfortunately, If you are in this room, you are committing one. So, mortal sins are conscious, willful turning away from God and are considered a big deal. They are mortal because without active repentance before death, they lead to the death of your soul, according to the theology. Okay? So, venial sins are sins that are committed without free will. So venial sins are like somebody made you do something wrong or you are completely ignorant of doing the sin. Those are venial sins. Those are secondary. But the mortal sins, I was thinking it was going to be the scary list of like doing something really bad. But I looked it up. There are 3 things required for a sin to be considered a mortal, meaning it threatens the very life of your soul. 3 things to be considered that. It has to be a grave matter. You have to know it's a sin, and you have to have free will in your participation in it. So I'm going to read a list of some things that are considered in the current list of the Catholic Church. These are based on the 10 Commandments that are mortal sins. Idolatry, divination, magic, sorcery, sacrilege. We're okay so far, maybe. Atheism, blasphemy, perjury, and failure to attend church. Okay. Murder, abortion, euthanasia, suicide, scandal, drug abuse, gluttony, alcohol abuse, terrorism, extreme anger, hatred, extortion, adultery, divorce. There's some other ones that I'm not going to read because I don't even want to go there. Theft, cheating, defrauding a worker of his wages, unfair rage, taking advantage of the poor, false witness, adulation, which that's an interesting one, lying, lust, avarice, and envy. Last part of the list, voluntary doubt of faith. There's a chance some of you are in trouble. Heresy, and this one's a heck of a challenge. Despair in hope. Like, if you feel despair, that's a mortal sin. By the time I got to this point in the list, I was feeling a little bit of the mortal sin of despair. Presumption, indifference, ingratitude, lukewarmness. I mean, this is some tough stuff. The soul death implicit in any of these acts is why, for specifically in the Catholic tradition, people go to confession every week. Because you have to explicitly, consciously, and actively seek repentance for these things before you die, or your soul is condemned. Now, so that's the context. Early conversations about sin were happening in the first centuries of the Christian church. And while that was happening, a group of monks living in the desert in Egypt made a list of things this was around the year 375. So there are these monks living in the desert in Egypt, and they wanted to do a better job being monks and being devoted. So they made a list of things that might weaken their devotion. The list included gluttony, lust, love of money, sadness, anger, listlessness, vainglory, and pride. The list started to get well known. Other people thought, that's a great list. We should use that list. And a couple hundred years later, in 590, Pope Gregory revised the list and created what we now know as the 7 deadly sins, which include, these are all mortal: pride, wrath, envy, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust. And for Pope Gregory, pride was the root of all the other sins. And we could spend all day. We could spend many days discussing the history of these concepts, debates around them, past and present. You know, there are many, many people who devote their entire lives to parsing out these different ideas about sin. But there's a few things I thought we might want to think about, some things I find particularly interesting about this history and about these concepts. First, I find it really fascinating that the polytheistic Greeks in pre-Christian times understood sin as a failure to achieve the full and true expression of your best potential. Isn't that interesting? That's a whole different framing, isn't it? The failure to achieve your true potential. And I'm not a philosopher, but it seems to me that to some extent they understood sin as falling out of a kind of innate harmony rather than falling into an innate badness. The hero is born heroic and then experiences a tragic fall in his or her lifetime. Okay? The Jewish perspective maintains the same sort of belief that we are not innately bad. It's a little bit closer to later Christian constructions, but the Jewish idea still holds that the condition of sin is one that is conditional to the human experience. Okay? Over time, though, Christianity itself developed a very different perspective. In the first 5 centuries after the life of Jesus of Nazareth, Christian doctrine came to hold that sinfulness is inborn, that we are inherently bad in some very basic way. And I want us to stop for a second and think about the enormous psychological and social ramifications of that. That's huge to be told. How many of us, whether we have these theologies or not, have some very basic fear that we're not okay, that we're not good enough, that we've done something wrong, that we should be different, that we should be better, that we should be other than we are. That is a core concept of our modern constructions of theology that has enormous ramifications for how we live our lives. What does that mean for us to think about this in UU congregations? In a UU congregation, many of us don't hold to claim any of these theologies, right? Many of us are here because we've said, I'm not real comfortable with those theologies. But what I would ask us to consider is, having been born into this culture, having been conditioned in this culture, is it possible that some of these constructions have gotten into us whether we say we believe them or not? So here's a question to ask. Do you believe, deep in your body, if you're truly honest, that some people are just born bad? Do you believe, if you're really honest, that maybe most people are born bad? Or that humanity as a thing is just basically corrupt? Or framed a different way, many of us have heard the phrase, the inherent worth and dignity of all persons, which is a core concept in Unitarian Universalist theology. And I'm going to ask you to answer this question with real internal honesty. Do you really, if you're honest with yourself, actually believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person? And I mean every person. Think about the people you're thinking about right now. I mean those people too. The inherent worth and dignity of every single person. How does the concept of sinfulness, these theologies of hamartia, how do they play out in ways that we judge others, that we understand other people's actions? How do they play out unconsciously in the ways we relate to our world? I think that we like to think as Unitarian Universalists that we've somehow gotten beyond these theological constructions. But I suspect that they are lurking behind the scenes. They certainly are for me. I mean, I happen to have been raised in a Catholic church, so they are deep in my body, right? They are lurking behind the scenes, quietly informing our day-to-day perceptions and judgments all the time. So what do we do about that? There are actually some clues in the Christian scriptures themselves. I will tell you right now that many Christian theologians would question my interpretations of the texts I'm about to share, okay? They'd be like, well, it didn't mean that. Okay, but I think there are some clues in the Christian scriptures themselves. So in the book of John, chapter 8, verse 7, when the Pharisees bring a woman caught in adultery to be judged, Jesus says to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And when the Pharisees leave, he tells the woman, "Neither do I condemn you. Go on your way, and from now on, do not sin again." In Matthew, book 6, or chapter 6, verses 14 through 15, this is in the lines that follow the presentation of what we now call the Lord's Prayer. So the Lord's Prayer is presented, and then in the 2 lines right after that, Jesus says this: "If you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." So it's sort of the root of that golden rule, right? Do unto others. It seems to me that there's some good templates suggested for how we might respond to the errors, the failings, the weaknesses, the mistakes, right? The stepping away from values that we see in ourselves and in our fellow humans. Forgiveness, compassion, and a really good dose of self-awareness seem to be an antidote to our more common tendencies of passing judgment and issuing condemnations. For me, this is what our proclaimed belief in the inherent worth and dignity of all persons means, right? We are all human. We all mess up. We all have moments of willfully doing what we just know we shouldn't do. You know, we've all done it. We're like, I really shouldn't do this. I'm going to do it anyway. I shouldn't say the thing. I shouldn't do the thing. I'm doing it anyway. We all make mistakes out of ignorance or fear or passion or whatever else. We all fail to honor each other and each other's inherent worth and dignity. We all do that. We all do that. And judging other people might be one of the ways that we are perhaps, as someone said, most sinful in our actions. If sin is making the mistake of not honoring what is valuable in other people. But we can make a practice of being loving to ourselves and one another, even in the face of such human lapses, right? So, you know, Westside has this kind of new slogan or tagline, right? Love unites us, caring connects us, and together we thrive as a community, right? So think about how that might apply here. If you put love at the center of the way you interact with the world, how does that impact judging? So you're a little suspicious of it.
Yeah.
Alice is suspicious of love at the center. How many of you, people agree with that. I think that a lot of people feel that way, right? So we're going to talk about holiness in a couple weeks, which is a way of thinking about love differently. Love is not delusional thinking. Love is not delusional thinking. That is something we as a community will be talking about. You've heard me say that the Unitarian Universalist Association has adopted this new statement of principles and purposes, and it includes accountability. We think that love means people getting away with stuff. That is not love. That is not love. True loving behavior includes accountability. So we're going to talk more about that. So if love with accountability were at the center, if we could look at someone we loved, or just another person whom we didn't necessarily think, oh, I love you, but if we just looked at them and said, you're another human being, and I'm going to be loving about this. Is it possible to hold each other accountable without shame or blame or judgment? That's going to be your homework this week, by the way. Can you imagine a way of holding others accountable while holding them in love without using the tools of shame or judgment? Tricky stuff. Tricky, tricky, tricky stuff. If we did nothing else for the rest of our lives, that particular exercise would be a fruitful one and an interesting one, a provocative one. So we here strive to practice that. Mutuality and accountability. As a community, we strive to hold ourselves and one another accountable for living our values, knowing that we won't do it. Knowing that we will fail because we are human. We strive to be a presence of love and caring in the world, knowing that there are all kinds of problems. We use our resources to support good work. This is the minute where I make the plug for that part, right? You can financially support the institution using the QR code on your screen or the QR code in the back of the room. You can stick cash or checks in the box. We're currently sharing our resources with the Unitarian Universalist Association. We engage in practices that are meant not to punish the wrongdoings of our fellow humans or to continue the harm in the natural world, but rather to encourage and support and affirm life and the actualization of the best selves of all of us. Right? So that's a very different framework, encouraging the actualization of the best, right? To be loving doesn't mean I look at you and say, no, it's no problem you did that thing that was really hurtful and awful and ouch. It means we say, ouch, can we talk about that? I don't see you as a bad person, but your actions cause harm. How can we fix it together? Do you hear how different that is? It is so easy to say, I can write this person off because they're a bad person, therefore I don't have to mess with them. I don't have to relate to that. I don't have to deal with it. It's much harder to say, in my care and concern for you, I am concerned about this choice. How can we explore and address it together? It's much more challenging. That's why we do it as a team. That's why we work together. That is why we have organizations like Unitarian Universalism, communities like this, to help each other with it. So together we are going to sing a closing song that gives us some much easier tips than just be love. It's very specific actions. This is actually, the words are from Confucius. It's an interesting mashup of the words of Confucius with like a 19th century, I think it's a Kentucky melody. It's a traditional folk melody. And I'm going to ask the choir to actually come up front. We'll be singing this again in a few weeks. So for those of you, you've probably never heard it, it's new to the choir can come up and stand in front, and I'm going to play it. The choir is going to sing. You're welcome to stay seated, sing along as you wish, or just listen. But look at the words, which offer us some options for ways to actually embody this kind of compassion. I'm going to play it through all the way once so you can hear it.
Remember
So you hear the golden rule in that. What you would wish not done to you, do not to other souls. So I'm going to invite you, if you would like to stand and make some connection with your neighbors. Again, you get to hold your own hands if you want to. You do not have to hold hands. But isn't it interesting? You know, most of the time we walk through society not acknowledging how connected we are to each other. You walk through the world, you look down. How hard is it to meet other people's eyes? Do the experiment right now. Tricky. It's a little safer in this room. Notice when we go through the world how hard it is to look into other people's eyes and have them look at us. Mostly we act like we're not connected, but if anybody has ever thought past, like one step past any action, we're all connected in all sorts of ways. Do not unto others what you would wish not done to you. If you make a mistake, how many of us have thought we were right about something? I'm right. And then we're like, oh wait, oops, I wasn't. Let us go into this week with the wish, the hope, and the aspiration of seeing the potential of someone actualizing a great gift instead of sin. Let us leave judgment behind and walk towards seeing the best possible coming from each person, including ourselves, that we encounter. Go in peace, go in passion, and go in hope that there may be a gift in front of you that you just haven't seen yet. May it be so.